Such a pleasure to be having this conversation with you, Chi Yin, on the occasion of your incredible show in Hong Kong, which is going to open soon. I have some questions about how you entered this project and where it has taken you. So maybe I can begin by asking a sort of large question about the rise of the nation state in Asia, and which actually happens after the 1950s in a way, like after the Second World War, and how the rise of the nation state confuses sense of belonging, of identity, of culture, of citizenship, all of this so central to your own work as well. And an additional complication is that communism, or in the person of your communist grandfather, and the kind of place it has had in terms of political movements in Southeast Asia, how that complicates the narrative of the nation. So your thoughts on that in relation to how and where you're positioning your work would be really useful.
Yeah, so obviously this is a take on a period of history before the nation state existed, and the people that whose oral histories I've begun from in making this work didn't have a concept of what the nation was. Malaya was a hodgepodge of ethnicities, and they kind of identify along ethnic lines. The Chinese predominantly still identified with China as ethnic Chinese. I think with some people who were born in Malaya, they had a sense of being Malayan born, but they weren't granted citizenship as British subjects. And the British, in fact, kind of came up with the identity card and national registration as a result of this period of emergency and counter-insurgency against the communists. In 1948, they introduced the identity card, and I think that's when the conception of Malayan nationhood maybe started to take real formalized shape.
Yeah.
But before then, people, it really depends who you ask, but in all the oral histories I've done, I do begin with, how did you identify yourself? Did you feel Malayan? Did you feel Chinese? Did you feel mainland Chinese and you were an immigrant in Malaya? And you get different responses from different people. But I think for the most part, for the leftists, there was a strong sense of identity with China. And I think that really became very strong and pronounced with the anti-Japanese war from 1937 onwards. This sense of anti-Japanese sentiment really swept through the Malayan Chinese population, and there are direct links between the anti-Japanese period to the anti-British period. Many of the people who then became Malayan communists had their beginnings in the anti-Japanese movement.
So I think what's also fascinating about the work is that there were Malay communists as well.
Yes.
But in this story, you don't really hear their voices so much. And while you say the national identity wasn't significant, it seemed like it was indeed in many ways an ethnic identity. Because China, even as a national entity, you can't really talk about it until the establishment of the PRC.
Yes.
And this again predates that sense of identification.
Yes.
When these the people that you talk to, when they became communists and saw themselves as anti-colonial, that was another layer that
Yes.
you don't find, say, in Western communism, right?
Yes.
So an anti-colonial has often meant in Asia identification with a potential nation state or a nation state to be, and therefore you're anti-colonial because you want to free that nation.
Yes.
Which is why this story is so fascinating.
I
because what nation are they trying to free? Because is that the purpose of the anti-Japanese struggle and the anti-British struggle?
Yes, I have asked them these questions also, and I mean, it is interesting because of these overlapping layers, and I have come to the kind of tentative conclusion that this war was really anti-colonial more than it was socialist communist. It was, even if they didn't have a fixed, stable idea of what the nation was that they wanted to create, what they were fighting against was the injustices of exploitation by the imperialist powers as they saw it. And when I do push them on, then what were you fighting to establish? They would say, well, we're trying to get rid of the British. And then claim for ourselves what land we have worked. So even as overseas Chinese, they felt that they had sweat and blood, on this land, and that they should have a piece of it. And then when I push them further, sometimes they say, oh, but then, the original people were the Malays, so they are very important and they should, have a big piece of this. And they had some conception of a multi-ethnic kind of a setup. They didn't really have a sense of what the nation state would be formally, look like, but they predominantly were animated by this idea of getting rid of the British, who were exploiting a land and somehow were unjustly benefiting from the fruits of this land.
So did the Japanese feature in that narrative of anti-colonialism?
Yes, they also saw
They are also colonizers.
Yes. Yeah, invaders, colonizers.
But not in the same way,
not
because
in the same
they
way.
Didn't own the resources in Malaya.
Only
right?
for that short period. Only for that short period. For instance, like the tin mine that you're sitting in front of, did fall into Japanese hands.
I see.
And they did take over plantations and, this kind of stuff. But, that was much more short-lived than the British. So in their minds, the British were the predominant colonial power that they wanted to push out.
As you know, there's a lot of historical scholarship on what's been called forgotten armies and forgotten wars. So do you see the war that was waged for so long under these emergency measures, as you call them, as one of these forgotten wars, and the people that you've talked to as belonging to those forgotten armies?
Yeah, I do think of them as a forgotten or hidden army, and this war has been forgotten by both the colonized and the colonizer, which is also why I've been thinking more and more about why I'm doing this work and how I make sense of my return to these histories and to this land and to this landscape and to these people. And I mean, way beyond my own family history. And I think, there's something about, people talk often about the notion of amnesia. And I'm not sure this is complete amnesia. I think it's more akin with what Anne Laura Stoller calls aphasia. It's an inability to find a language to speak about it, rather than having forgotten it completely. I think it's somewhere there in the back of our histories. It's inflected in many different ways in current day politics, but we're not able to speak about it in anything apart from the very triumphant tone that the official historiography has taken
Of the nation state.
Of the nation state, of the colonial power, and then inherited by the nation state. Right. This narrative of a very successful textbook example of a counterinsurgency that succeeded in quelling the local indigenous communist movement and then led to the independence and the founding of the nation state of Malaysia and Singapore. I mean, that narrative was crafted by the British in response to the Cold War, around the world, and it was directly inherited by the independent states that became Malaysia and Singapore, and persists till today. Right. In Singapore and Malaysia today, if you see any memorialization of this war, it is of that narrative. It is of the smashing of the communists. And that is not to say that that's not valid or accurate. I think it was, but it is definitely one perspective of this war.
So you bring up the notion of amnesia that is not amnesia, the inability to find a language in which to talk about these histories. But you're not a historian, at least not in any conventional sense. What makes you go this route, that you are doing photography, you're doing photo installations, you're doing video, you're working with the objects, you're working with the sound and music. How does this give you a different kind of entry point into talking about this history?
Yeah, so I was trained as a student of history. I did both my first degrees in history and now I'm doing a PhD in war studies. So my training is quite traditionally historical. And then I became a journalist for the first sort of 10 years of my career. So that there is, my beginning points are this sort of documentation and almost truth-seeking for all the problematics that come with that. But increasingly I found that frustrating and unsatisfactory. And I think I'm in a space now where I realize that a lot of these memories and these narratives of experience in this war are, I guess if you want to be unkind about it, you would say unreliable or unstable. And I kind of want to find a form that gives room to the ambiguities that come with recounting and, retelling these stories and reconstituting these memories, but at the same time giving respect to these memories, even if they are supposedly unreliable. And I'm finding that in photography that's slightly more metaphorical and less literal, and in the songs, in the music, and in the installation, which gives room for multiple interpretations and multiple layers, I'm finding more room and license for me in the making of the work, as well as maybe hopefully for the viewer in experiencing the work.
One would imagine that you might naturally gravitate towards filmmaking, because that's more to do with the, an understanding of narrative and trying to capture like what happened in a sequential or chronological way, at least to some extent. So it's fascinating that you should choose the still image to tell a story. So I wondered if you had anything to say about your particular methodology and how you go about doing, say, your oral history interviews, why that allows you then to come up with these absolutely still images. How do you make them tell the story you want them to tell?
Yeah, I've chosen for the moment still images and more sort of photographic and filmic installations rather than a film proper, because I also realized that the nature of memory is fragmentary. It's not linear, it's not sequential, and it's almost more assemblage-like than a straightforward sort of documentary film. So although in doing the oral history work, I have made straight ahead documentation film footage of the participants of this war, I've chosen not to use that in showing the work, because I kind of feel a construction or reconstruction is somehow more interesting at this point for me as a maker. And my methodology basically begins from fact-finding and truth-seeking in a way. I do a lot of research, both archival and secondary material research. And in terms of these landscapes, they come from specific pieces of research. So each of these places have a specific history. There was a specific ambush or a gunfire fight that happened in some of these sites. And then I go driving around looking for how to photograph these sites in an evocative, atmospheric way to try and go beyond the literal facts of the place. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping the still image, with its stillness and its room for imagination and transcendence, can maybe help us leap into another realm of thinking about this war. It sort of replicates what I did with my work on the Nobel Peace Prize Commission on Nuclear Weapons 2 years ago, where I created a set of diptychs between North Korean nuclear landscapes and American Cold War era nuclear landscapes. And it works with the same idea of a suspension of sense of place. So although they come from very specific pieces of historical research, when you look at the image, you almost are taken into a different mental zone if possible, if that's what it achieves. I kind of am working towards the suspension of sense of place.
That's really interesting, because while you might actually suspend the sense of place, it's actually anchored in a very specific place. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you want to say something about your notion of spatial haunting. That is a very evocative phrase, and I wonder how the stillness of the image allows you to explore this idea of the haunting of that particular space.
Yeah, so I've become quite taken with this notion that the landscapes that I've driven around in northern Malaysia and southern Thailand are a kind of unspoken archive of this war that was never declared. And I mean, they look very everyday, these landscapes, but I know that behind them, underneath them, are these layers of histories. And I began to wonder what the land remembers, and what the land and the inanimate things, or the animate things, non-human things, can see that I can't see. And I then try to work with this notion of the camera and photography as very indexical. But I was trying to sort of also push against that indexical nature of photography by almost asking, what is it that the camera sees that I can't maybe see with my own eyes? And in some places, it happened more than in others. So, for example, the picture of the elephant in the jungle. What does the elephant remember that I don't know? And then when somehow there was this encounter between me, my camera, and this elephant, there was something there that I couldn't articulate. There's something in that land that I can't put my finger on. And, I kind of then want to just leave these as kind of question marks, on the walls.
I want to know what it was like to collect the songs from the movement of the time, and how they somehow give you access to an experience and a memory that just talking about that period doesn't. Because both your video installations are about the songs.
Yeah. I mean, the songs, after collecting these materials for the last, I guess, 6-7 years or so, so after every oral history interview, I will ask them, do you remember any songs from that time? And
so why did you feel impelled to ask that question?
Because I think song has a power that just speaking does not. I think song just transports us into a completely different emotional realm. It's not something that you can just speak about. I think song has this transportative nature, and I have become very moved by the songs. I think they somehow gut punch me, even though I've collected so much stuff from this time, and a lot of it is, the oral histories can be very emotional also. I've interviewed people for hours, and sometimes it's like layer upon layer of tragedy that, impacted their lives. But then when they start singing, there's something about it that's very deeply emotional. And it's also giving them agency to reclaim those memories of participating in this time of war, in this period of the Cold War, which they don't conceive of as the Cold War, but they were the foot soldiers of this movement, and they all have memories of having learned and sung these songs almost daily in the movement. So the songs, are a way for me to also give them voice and give them agency in reclaiming their own memories and experiences of this war. And what I've done with this particular installation, cut for this particular show, is I've spliced together different people singing the same song, almost as a memory relay race, if you like. And in some cases where some individuals have forgotten the lyrics of some parts of song, another person from another part of the movement have come in to fill in for them, and then passes the baton back to that person. So it becomes a sort of a relay race, as it were. And there's something quite emotional about that. I mean, they were all members of the same movement. They didn't necessarily know one another. And these films were made across the 4 different territories. And, when I splice them together and those memories merge, there's something happening when that takes place.
And they're all singing in Chinese.
They're all singing in Chinese. In one particular song, the Internationale, that also comes back to your question about nationhood and this, question of nationalism versus communism. They were obviously singing and harking to an international movement of socialism. And there was some sense that they understood that this movement was bigger than them and Malaya, or even China. And so it's very interesting when you hear them sing these words, and even the Internationale has been transliterated into Chinese. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. And yeah, I mean, so when I splice these videos together of, people who are now exiled in southern Thailand or exiled in, deported to southern China, and when you splice them together, something happens in that relationship. And when you splice 2 people singing, "Oh Malaya, Malaya, oh Malaya, Malaya," and their voices start to overlap and interplay, I find that quite an interesting effect.
So while they're gesturing towards the international and towards China, they are singing about Malaya, right? So the sense of belonging that finally echoes through the project is about Southeast Asia.
It is about Southeast Asia, and it is about, it's been surprising to me how many of the people who were, the 31 or 35,000, depending on which statistics you look at, who were deported by the British during this 12-year war, mostly to China, a few to India. How many of them were Malayan born? and how many were, as a result, British subjects, and how the British then circumvented their own regulations to banish these people, as if the only thing that mattered was ancestry and ethnicity, you know. And I mean, it's been interesting for me to also think about that in the context of current geopolitics and how this sort of offshoring of undesirable elements continues till today.
What are your expectations about where this project will take you now? Or do you have a new project that departs from this or extends this?
I'm working on an extension of this project currently. I'm looking in the official British military photographic archive, and I'm reinterpreting some of the ways they represented these so-called bandits and communist terrorists. So I'm making new images based on the photographic record of this war. So that's the next chapter of this work that I'm doing. And in the meantime, I'm continuing with oral histories just because these people are very, very elderly, and I'm just sort of in a race against time to bottle their stories.
Sure.
And I think I'll continue with this landscape strand of work because of this sense of spatial haunting. I feel I'm not done with this. I feel like there's more haunting than we know. So I feel like I just need to go out and keep collecting it.
So I think maybe we should conclude on this note that clearly the haunting you're speaking about has a deep impress on the present. And that's what you, as a young contemporary artist, continue working with these spaces and with these histories. And you don't see your work as being done anytime in the future, right?
No, it's not done. I do feel like the conversation about the impact of colonialism and the legacies of empire, whether British, French, Dutch, or whatever, haven't been fully reckoned with either by the formerly colonized or the metropole, the colonizers. I feel like those conversations have barely started in a proper way. And having been based in London for the last half a year or so, and experiencing all this talk about Brexit and Empire 2.0, has been very interesting for me because I'm like, this is 2019, what are you talking about, you know? And I think not having reckoned with the histories of what happened has direct links to what we're seeing today. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Chi Yin. I'm Tejaswini Niranjana on behalf of Hanart Art Gallery, conducting this conversation with this amazing photographer that you must all come and see.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
Are we good?
Ooh, okay.
So good, and I took lots of beautiful photos.
Oh.
I'll forward to you guys.
Send them to me.
Yes, I will.
I think we are